I want to thank Patricia Zavala, the executive director of both PowerHouse Texas and the caucus, and then Lindsay Lambert, who is working for the caucus working for PowerHouse Texas for putting this fantastic event together. The Texas Energy and Climate Caucus and PowerHouse Texas are sister organizations. The caucus was founded shortly before the blackouts in 2021 that I'm sure you all remember. And those of y'all who are staff remember how a few days after those events, as we all were starting to get our water and our lights back on, we all looked up and went, what just happened? And discovered that in this building, our base knowledge around energy issues really wasn't where we hoped it would be answering the questions we needed to answer about trying to make sure that our grid was stable and secure for all Texans. And so even though the caucus was founded about 2 weeks before that, I also feel like I have to give a shout out to Eugenie Sheev, who's in the office, who was instrumental in putting the caucus together. A couple weeks after that, we really dove into these issues and started doing work trying to educate members about how the grid worked, what the different factors were, and what steps we could consider moving forward. And we wanted to educate not only members, but their staff. Because as all of y'all know who work for members, your members generally are only as smart as you are. So thank you for the work you're doing to make sure we are informed. And then we, in the process of building out the caucus, spun off PowerHouse Texas, a C3, that really is just focused on this educational side of the work. And this work is being funded through PowerHouse Texas and through some grant funding we've been lucky to receive. I do want to acknowledge our fellowship program. We have pictures of our inaugural class of policy fellows. As part of our work to try and make sure that we had staff that were engaged and informed on these issues, we actually recruited people to come work in the building who have a specific interest in environment and policy. So our fellows are Natalie Villafranca, who's with Representative Rafael Anchia, Cameron Granados, who's with Representative Todd Hunter, Hussein Shah with Representative Drew Darby, Julie Blocker with Senator Carol Alvarado, Anaga Upal with Representative Cecil Bell, and Denise Palacios with me, Representative Aaron Sweener. So we're discussing today the grid again, and is it fixed? What else do we need to have on our minds as we consider these issues that are likely to come before us again this session? And this, to me, is some of the core work we need to do, is making sure that when y'all are working on amendments or working on bill drafts, that you're operating with every bit of information you can, that when members are on the floor voting, we're operating with every bit of information we can. So this is, unfortunately still a very timely topic because I think we all expect bills related to how our grid functions to come back to the floor this session. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. I'm really grateful for the fantastic group we have here today. Port Arthur native Pat Wood III has a long career in energy from offshore in Indonesia with ARCO to leading the Public Utility Commission of Texas and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission under George W. Bush. Wood has been a key player in the market transition of the nation's natural gas, telecom, and power industries. As CEO of the Hunt Energy Network, he leads a team developing distributed power assets across Texas. In recent years, he served on the boards of SunPower, Quanta, Dynergy, and Luma, the new operator of Puerto Rico's power grid. He's also a Texas A&M civil engineer, Harvard lawyer, and a father of 4 boys. Thanks for joining us, Pat.
How do we get our electricity? We think about it really as 3 buckets, and I kind of go from right to left. Power generation, which is everything from coal plants to wind farms, solar, natural gas. Some states have hydro. Transmission grid, which is the big wires that go across the state, ones you usually see. The ones in your neighborhood are distribution, which is the part on the right. I have a big blowout on the right because partly that's the world I'm involved in. That's where the little star is down the bottom. Distributed generation, that's what I do. Storage and potentially some thermal peakers down there as well. But that's kind of new to the mix. But The rest of it's old. It's wires that get it from the power generation to your house are about a century old. So this has been the structure for a long, long time. But we call it generation, wires, and then at the customer end, we call it retail. So it's a little different than this map right here. But generally, think about it as kind of generation is where most of the dollars are. And then you got a regulated wires business. So when we split up the Texas market, which I'll tell you about in a minute, we came to the conclusion that the far left box and the customer-facing part of the right box should be competitive, and the rest of it should stay regulated. We'll talk about that in a sec. When we talk about ERCOT is an Electric Reliability Council of Texas. It actually is a physical definition that is, oops, I went too far. That is this part of the map. The gray parts of the map that are also in Texas are, and some of you may be working for members that do represent these parts of Texas, they are regulated by FERC, which is the agency I went to lead after I was here. So it is a four-letter word, but it's not that bad of a place. But it's a differently regulated setup than what we have here in Texas. I'm happy to answer that in the breakout session for those of you that may have unique issues there. But we focused, and then this talk will focus really on this part of Texas, which is where 90% of the electric demand or electric load demand consumption, those are all kind of the same word when we say load. So how is that load being served? And it's changed a lot over time. The blue is gas, and so it's 2006 is the bottom. Last year is the top. So as you'll see, gas has stayed pretty stable. Coal used to be a much bigger player and has come down significantly due to really changes in federal and state environmental laws, but also economics. The blue wedge that looks like a little tornado is, in fact, wind. It's gone up quite a bit. The green is nuclear, which has stayed we have two large nuclear stations, which are probably two of the newest ones built in the nation. They'll be here for a while. They're in decent shape. I've toured both of them back in my day, and they're well maintained. So like most nuclear stations, they're subject to intense federal oversight for their safety and their security. That little yellow botch that you start seeing coming up there in the upper right is going to get huge, but that's solar. And then the purple is kind of miscellaneous other because some people just need that. So how does that's how it looked on an annual basis, but how does it look on a day-to-day basis? These were two snapshots from my phone last week. ERCOT has a great new app. ERCOT has learned a few things about communicating with the public since the Uri episode, but one is giving geeks like me great data. And so on the left, it was the 18th because I took the snapshot on the 19th. So I think it was Thursday. So you see there, a very windy day. So the wind in this model is the blue. So it was actually the majority of the day throughout the day, steadily. The little solar at the top is the orange part at the top. You can imagine that would be in the middle of the day. The following day, interestingly enough, had a lot more solar, but the wind almost disappeared at sunset. So look at that. And then so who filled in the mix but gas? So gas has kind of been that dispatch, that variable fuel that kind of fills in the mix because it's more expensive to run a gas unit than to do solar or wind. And so those two, I didn't know I got sound effects. But that just shows you on a day-to-day basis, it can vary, from the annual to the day. It matters. And so those things drive a lot of it. This is a really busy slide. The key point I wanted to make here was that on the left are the levelized, which means kind of spread out over the life of a new wind plant, which is the dark blue. And wind is also getting a nice federal subsidy, so that's the light blue. So that reflects wind unsubsidized and subsidized. And then solar, unsubsidized and subsidized. So those four, they are kind of the main new entrants into the Texas market. So that's why I picked this slide, because that was relevant to comparing them to the running costs, not building a new power plant out of gas, coal, or nuke, but running the existing power plant. So that's a very interesting comparison. Is it cheaper to build a new wind? It is cheaper to build a new wind plant than to continue to run a gas plant, the subsidized. And you'll see that that's the second box versus the last box. I'll leave these slides behind so y'all can study them, but that's a profound change in the economics. The technology has come so far, the innovation that has implemented itself through the wind, the solar and now me in the battery business, it's fun. It's the double black diamond part of life where you're just going down in cost and just getting the speed of your life. And it's really been fascinating, but it also has policy implications for our grid, which is kind of why we're here today. The grid itself, that's the goal. You want to be the star people right in the middle, doing cheap, doing clean, doing reliable. This was really the goal that was told to me back by Governor Bush back in 96 or something, when he told me, Pat, we like wind. And I'm like, I was this kind of Reagan Republican type and thinking wind is just there with, Crocs and driving a Volvo and, granola. And I was just like not into that, but my boss told me I was into that. So I went back and we found out that not only was I supposed to be into it, but so many people in Texas on left and right were very supportive. So it was a wonderful moment of bipartisanship that I hope and pray and I'm a strong advocate for that comes back and stays here forever, because this is a resource God gave us in Texas. And we were smart enough in the 20th century to learn how to pull it out of the ground. And we ought to be smart enough to know how to use what's above the ground this century. And it sounds like with geothermal, we may be back in the ground again. So listen to Doug's next podcast, and you'll be in good shape. But this was the goals of what we wanted to get out of our system, because this was what we had. We had reasonably priced electricity. It was quite reliable. It wasn't particularly clean, though, back in 1999 when we began to restructure the market. So when we talk about the market, and let's talk about these, because these terms will come up for y'all that are working this session. There's really three batches of dollars that people get their money from when they're thinking about how to make money in the market. Real-time energy is the bulk of the dollars comes from the energy market. And so that's the fuel, like say gas unit. That's the fuel in that unit, and then some contribution perhaps toward the fixed cost of that. So that's what you're paying for in the energy market. I drew a line there halfway because ancillary services are kind of half and half. Some of them are real-time fine-tuning of the market just to keep, power demand fluctuates like this all the time. And when you've got renewable energy and even regular, gas and coal energy, they kind of fluctuate as well. So you got to have something that kind of levels that out, because we want that to stay at 60 hertz all the time, and it has to. It really can't deviate from that by very much at all. So that ancillary services, which batteries, for example, are good providers of because they react so quickly, provide that ancillary service fine-tuning. That's been a small bucket of dollars up to now. As Carrie will tell you, our next presenter, that's becoming a bigger bucket of dollars, and is kind of perhaps part of the solution to what we might consider being the long-term fix for Texas, is that bucket might be even a little bit bigger to solve some of these problems. But it may not be, and so that's what the round circle is there, is there's a unused capacity. Is Bill, who's our third provider, is one of the largest providers of electricity generation in the state. Their plants aren't running all the time. Some of them run a lot, like the nuclear power plants run a lot, but some of the gas plants don't. And so that unused capacity isn't free. It came at a cost. But our current market design is such that, and I'll hop to that. Well, I'll get to that in a second. Our vision back at that time was to make sure that when we split up the market into its relevant pieces, again, the pieces being generation, delivery, wires, and retailing, that we end up with a system that has better prices, has better customer service, that puts a premium on technological innovation, that puts risk in the right place, and I'll mention that on the next slide, and that ends up with utilities who are focused on doing their job better. Because the governor was irritated that he told me this point blank to my face when he hired me for the job in 95. The utilities care more about what we think, and he went like this, meaning House and Senate and himself, than what their customers think, and that's wrong, and we're going to change that. So when he talked about focus on utilities, that's really the point that I mean there. So how did it work out? After we did this bill in 1999, I stayed around for the next 2 years to implement it before leaving to go into D.C. and then pass the baton to another group to finish the job, and they did, I think, a good job. We ended up having a very rapid turnover of the generation fleet. The inefficient units got shut down by the market, not by an environmental regulator, but by the marketplace. And both old gas plants, as well as more recently, even in recent years, you saw how that coal part has gone down. those plants are 40-something years old. So they're maintained great through the years, but over time they become overrun by more competitive new technology. And so that's what happened. We got a lot of new gas built. I should have put that line in here. We got 20 gigawatts of gas built kind of right off the bat. And then an additional, as of last week, about 40 gigawatts. Gigawatts, again, our total system, as you'll see on the next bullet, is 90. So we had 20 from new gas, 40 from new wind and solar that have been built since we opened our new market in 2000, 2001. That's pretty much. I mean, we are the number 5 nation in the world with regard to renewable electricity on our grid. And as you saw from that map last week, there are days here when we're 80% renewable. And if you count the nuke, we're 90% carbon free. So it's, people talk about New York and California that said, well, we're really red down here, but hey, it's pretty damn green too. Customer pricing has gone down. This last year had a nice spike in prices because the driving fuel of our pricing here in Texas and in many parts of the country is natural gas. And after the Ukrainian issues with Mr. Putin, the natural gas prices went dramatically up for everybody in the world. And they've settled down quite a bit in recent days. But over time, we have saved about 25 to 40% lower prices in the power market, adjusted for inflation in those 25 years. Many customers are wanting to contract directly for renewables or to contract for other things and to support other types of industries there. And we have a lot of retailers that own the customer, and Bill, our third speaker today, is representing one of those. But where do we save that money? People say, Pat, where'd y'all get the savings in Texas? Power plants that have to compete against each other as opposed to make a showing to a regulator once every 4 years are more efficient. It just is not that hard to kind of figure out that was going to happen, and in fact, it did happen. We, meaning I'm in the power business now, and I've been on the board chairman of others, we take lower power margins than the regulated utilities do. Regulated utilities get a 14, 15% pre-tax rate of return. When I was chairman of Dynegy, we were happy to get 3. So it's just a competitive market, both on the generation side and then at the retail side. And it's known City of Austin, for example, is not open to retail competition, but most of the rest of Texas is. And there's significant competition put down at the retail customer side, and you will see it if you go to powertochoose.org. It's kind of a clearinghouse webpage. You can get a lot of prices just for any given zip code in Texas. It's kind of fun to see just how much they've tracked the price up and how much they've tracked the price down. But that's impactful not just to residential customers, but to commercial customers, industrial customers. It has been a real selling point for the state that we've had a lot of widespread and cheap electricity. And that's why last February 2 years ago, was such a black eye for the state, that we took such a black eye for the reliability. We were clean and we were cheap, but boy, we sure weren't reliable. People died because of that. And that honestly still keeps me kind of up at night when I think about that. What could I have done in my day to have made sure that never happened? But we can talk about that later. This is the key right here. The debate right now, unused capacity cost is not borne by the customers like it was in the old world. It's borne by the market. So when I think about us, the regulated utilities, which like City of Austin would be one, Entergy, some of the ones in Texas that aren't in the ERCOT market would be up in the upper left, where 100% of the burden is on the back of the customer. That slides all the way down to ERCOT. Let me see, I don't know if that works too well. The ERCOT open market, yeah, that's pretty much on the slide. ERCOT open market is where we are today. And so the question is, should maybe that be kind of slid up a little bit so that risk is a little bit more back on the customer? That's part of the debate, and Bill and Carrie will crack that open for you here. I just happen to be in the storage business. I think that the future of the grid is decentralizing, so that's where I want to be playing. I like that sandbox. It's not too crowded out there. Not a lot of kids are playing out there with us, so we're learning a lot of this with the utilities ourselves. This is our first battery out there in West Texas. It's an unusually green picture. Last thing I wanted to mention, energy efficiency. It's the lowest hanging fruit. It's the easiest thing is the kilowatt hour you don't use. If you can do things to save it. And there is a role for government here, because sometimes it doesn't really fall to customers to understand how they can, it's an information market failure, quite frankly, on our part. Texas was higher on this right after we opened the market in 1990 or 2001. We were kind of in the teens, but we've dropped. We had some knobs, and those knobs are still in the statute. We have to answer that on questions, but I don't ascribe to be California here, but they are doing some good stuff out on the left coast. It's not a shame to admit it. Bottom line, end of the day, where are we going? This is the end of the century. I think we move on to, we have different kinds of generation. We'll have smaller nuclear plants, upper left, a lot of electrified transportation, probably a lot of electrified everything else too. But it'll be low carbon or zero carbon generation that we look at. Hydrogen, I put that in there. Who asked me about hydrogen? There's the H2. Sorry, it's not shown too well here. Right there in the bottom, right in here on the left. But the one, of course, I love storage because I'm in the battery business, but real-time demand response is that ability of the customer to react to price. And unfortunately, the legislature shut one of those key programs down, and my hope is in a couple years after people get over the gritty problem, we'll turn it back on. But it was very helpful to have a market indicator there to people that at this moment, your price of your electricity is going to cost you $2 instead of 2 cents. So why don't you cut back? So anyway, that kind of thing will come. But those will be the parts of our system going forward. So I am pleased now to turn it back to Aaron to introduce Carrie. I'll leave it.
Thank you so much, Pat, and thank you for thinking I look youthful since this job has aged me. Next, we're going to have Carrie Bivens up. She is the Vice President at POTOMAC Economics and serves as the Independent Market Monitor Director for the ERCOT region. Prior to joining POTOMAC Economics, Ms. Bivens worked at ERCOT for over 13 years, most recently as Director of Wholesale Operations. She started her career at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and earned a BBA in Operations Management from the University of Houston. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Bivens.
Hello, everybody. I wanted to start by talking about what is the Independent Market Monitor, what do we do? We're responsible for monitoring the market, looking for market manipulation or market power abuses, and we refer those to the Public Utility Commission for enforcement. So that's kind of one part of our business is investigatory. The other part is that we are currently monitoring the market also to make sure that it is efficient and effective and it's actually meeting the goals that it's supposed to meet. And that's kind of what I'm here to talk today is a little bit about market design. We've been the Independent Market Monitor since 2006, our firm, POTOMAC Economics, and we contract with the Public Utility Commission to perform that role. So let me talk a little bit about electricity markets. So let's zoom out a little bit and talk about...
Carrie, I might have buried that slide at the back when I was... You keep talking, I'm going to look at something real quick.
Okay. That's all right. I will... Electricity markets are hard, and why are they so hard? I want to talk about what are some of the challenges. Yes, thank you. That's perfect. So first of all, the objectives in the short run is just to make sure you have a whole suite of generating facilities in the state, and you want to deploy them in an optimal way. That's a short run way. You have exactly what you need, and you just deploy it to meet the reliable needs of the grid. In the long run, you want to incentivize investment with the right mix, the right resources to meet the long-term resource adequacy needs of the grid. And so the reason this is challenging is a couple of things. So as Pat was talking about is that, the frequency has to be 60 hertz. We have to balance supply and demand instantaneously every millisecond. What the generators are providing has to equal what the load is demanding. And that is really unique to electricity markets. And then on top of that, you have generators that have all sorts of constraints. Once they start, they have to run for 6 hours, or they have minimum amounts that they have to run. There's all these types of physical constraints of those systems. There's also physical constraints of the transmission system. You have this wire system in the middle, and it can only accommodate so many electrons. If you put too many electrons on it, it burns down, and you have to make sure that you're not sending too many electrons over those wires. And that's one of the functions of ERCOT is to do that balancing. You also have sudden changes. All of a sudden, a generator trips offline, and you have to replace those megawatts. Or a line goes down, and you have to figure out how to get power to Houston. Now, next is limited demand response. So you can move all these generators up and down, but you really have a limited amount of ability to move load, consumers, households up and down. We're a fixed amount. We want to turn our lights on and have the lights come on. And we're not necessarily putting bids into a market to decide, oh, after $5, I don't want to pay anymore. There's really not a lot of demand response. And so that is one of the challenges for pricing in electricity markets, is that there's very little on the demand side to balance the market. Another challenge is fuel availability, and this is kind of expanded a little bit in a number of ways. Is the sun shining? Is the wind blowing? Is there enough natural gas supply to burn natural gas for generators? All of that availability is becoming a big topic of consideration. It's always been a consideration, but it's much more, lately. And what I just kind of generally put in the term of externalities. So that's everything outside the market that impacts the market. It's the IRA, it's subsidies for different types of generation, it's ESG goals for companies, it's municipals who are setting their own clean energy goals. All of those are externalities that are disciplining the markets and creates a challenge to try to figure out how do we do this long-term goal of incentivizing investment. Everything's
All
back.
the way back.
Okay, I'll go this way.
Yep.
Okay, so all of that's to say it's a unique market, and one of the ways in which we ensure that the market creates the right signals is through what we call shortage pricing. The prices have to get high when there's not enough of it in order to incentivize long-term investment of generation. And ERCOT is the shining example of needing, our market design is designed upon letting those high prices come in to allow those prices to provide those economic signals. Though it's a necessary part for the market design to work. It includes a high offer cap, meaning prices can get very high. It also has an administrative demand curve, and I'll talk about that next. That comes in place of the demand response is not putting bids into the market. So administrators, regulators have to come in on their behalf and say, how much are you willing to pay to not lose energy in this particular hour? And I have to put that on as a regulator, as an administrator, on behalf of all the consumers in the state. Year to year, there's a lot of variability. So because we're only paying for energy when it's generated, when there's not shortages, if we don't have a weird weather year, if there's plenty of capacity, then the energy prices are low and generator revenues are similarly low. In the last few years, we've had significant pricing, and we've met one of the kind of indicators of whether or not the market is producing enough revenue. We've met that 3 of the last 4 years. So it is providing the signal that we need to invest new generation in the market. So this is that demand curve I was talking about. It was put in place in 2014, but the commission at the beginning of this year made a change to it. And it said, I'm going to take that really high price and bring it down so that we don't get to that $9,000 price anymore. We'll bring it down to $5,000. But I'm going to make the curve, we call it fatten the tail, make the curve so that in this area you spend most of your time in where there's like not that much shortage, maybe just a little bit. We'll make that higher so that we're incrementing shortage pricing all the time, very frequently. And the effect of that is just to produce more pricing, more shortage pricing, more frequently during intervals that are less short, but to lower that max value when we're really in the thick of it so that people aren't paying that much. This change has resulted in increased energy revenue for generators of $1.7 billion through this year. That's about 6% of the total energy value in ERCOT for 2022. So it's a significant change that the commission has already done. They also have other, what they've called phase 1 PUC reforms. So they have phase 1 of the market redesign was changing that operating reserve demand curve. was weatherizing generation resources, requiring that weatherization, putting penalties in place, mapping critical natural gas facilities. They put in a firm fuel supply service where you pay certain generators to have oil on site in order to burn oil in case there's a natural gas supply issue. Deploy demand response sooner. So we used to only do that in emergency. Now we do that more frequently. And then broadly, this is not technically phase one, but ERCOT has done what they call conservative operations since July of 2021. And that is a command and control posture. So instead of letting the market work and decide when to bring generators on and when to let the prices be high, they instead have this command and control posture where they're deciding when to bring generators on. And they've also added this procurement of ancillary services. One of them called non-spin almost doubled this procurement of that ancillary service, and that has an annualized cost of about $800 million to $1 billion. So when I'm asked, what do we need to do now? It's not that we don't need to do anything. It's that we've already done a lot. A lot has already been done since Winter Storm Uri. A lot of revenue has been put into the system. And I argue that we need to let that work and let the incentives work and let the market decide what to do with those incentives. We have a market with a low barrier to entry, which means that people aren't going to leave money on the table. So if people are making 50% of over the standard fixed cost recovery profit, then that money is not going to be left on the table forever. The investors will come and capture it. So I'm trying to be quick because we don't have a whole lot of time, but there's a couple of proposals in the phase two market design. Performance credit mechanism was just approved by the commission, and really it talks about paying people not just for the generation of those electrons, of producing energy, but also just to be available when there are high-risk hours. So it's going to measure what are the 30 highest risk hours, and if you're online and available, it will pay you for the capacity of your resource during that time. By doing that, it will establish a reliability standard and ensure that every year it will procure enough credits to meet that reliability standard. We currently only have an advisory reliability standard. Otherwise, we don't actually have a regulatory one. Our view is that the energy-only market is an effective pay-for-performance mechanism and that we don't need to add this separate availability payment because if you can capture $5,000 revenue to be available during high-risk hours, that's all the incentive you need to be online and available during that time. The last thing that has come on is, should we put something on in the interim before this performance credit mechanism goes into place? And one has been championed by a commissioner called the Backstop Reserve Service. And essentially, it's just procuring resources or keeping older resources, paying them to be online whenever we're in emergency conditions, price them at the cap, kind of hold them out of the market so that there's this backstop of reliability in case there is any issues. We think that's not needed as a solution. The current market is already meeting the reliability standard. We don't need to procure anything else in order to make it work. If the desire is to change the command and control nature of the ERCOT market, we have some ideas on how to do that. But this out-of-market procurement is not based on fundamentals, is not the way to go. Although it is better than some sort of state procurement of resources, which is a proposal that has come up in the past to just have the state buy resources, and that's just a market killer for sure. The last thing I just want to leave you with is that there are a number of resources that are coming online here in the next few years. Battery energy storage, we have about 2,000 to 2,500 right now. And in 2023, we're going to get, or 2024, we're going to get about 5,000 megawatts more of that. Solar is booming. We're going to get 10 to 20,000 more of that in the next 2 years, a little bit more wind, and we do still have some gas in the queue. So when people say that you're not building gas resources, we are building gas resources. It's just we're building more solar. And that's all I got. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Our last speaker today is Bill Barnes, who is the Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs for NRG located in Austin. He is responsible for covering ERCOT market design issues for the retail and wholesale electricity markets. He represents NRG at the Texas Legislature, the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and in the ERCOT stakeholder process. And Bill, my apologies, but Patricia asked me to remind you that your talk is 5 minutes because I think she's getting a little nervous about time. So please welcome Bill Barnes, y'all.
So I have a few very specific discussion topics, and then I'm going to tease the next part of the discussion, which is our panel debate on really market design. The first main item that I wanted me to cover is really the stakeholders or the participants that are engaged in this debate. And I wanted to break down really how that landscape looks from two different perspectives. One is the competitive territories in the ERCOT region. The grid itself has two components, competitive and non-competitive. About 75% of all electricity consumed is in the competitive territories. And I'm using a chart similar to what Pat used it breaks down the components of the energy system, the electrical system, from power plants to delivery to the consumer. And obviously in the competitive territories, the benefit there is all generation and delivery services, and the provision of retail is unbundled. It has been completely deregulated or restructured. And of the participants that you see there, first is how the overall market structure works in terms of how ERCOT operates, and that is the delivery of electricity from the power plants, which is typically known as generators, through the wires from the transmission system to the distribution system, then to the consumer. And sitting on top of that commercial structure is what's called a qualified scheduling entity, and that is where the system was designed so that portfolios of generation and load could be served together as kind of a hedge. They would come together in the ERCOT system for scheduling and for credit, and those queasies sitting at the top typically would be like an NRG or a Vistra. We also see power marketers like banks, financial institutions that represent hedges for those entities, or queasy service providers like a Tenaska that offers services to manage load and generation. And then the kind of taking the level down on who is providing retail service to the customers themselves, those are typically referred to as load-serving entities, or in the competitive territories, retail electric providers. And that would be example brands there would be Reliant, TXU, Just Energy. And then on the pure generation side, that would be entities like Calpine, TexGen, Cogentrix, those that invest, own, and operate generation plants. Also, that would be your solar, wind, and battery providers as well. And then on the wire side, the transmission and distribution service providers are typically all within the same utility structure: Oncor, CenterPoint, AEP. In the non-competitive side, all of those components are essentially bundled together into the same entity that is basically gets a regulated rate of return and a captive rate base for their services. Those entities, which I'm sure you're familiar with, would be your CPS, City of Public Service for San Antonio, Austin Energy, Brazos, LCRA, and then the LSEs are typically co-ops that are represented by those entities, like Pertinalis, which is one of the biggest electric co-ops in the United States. And then those entities also own generation, like CPS, LCRA, Brazos, and STEC, and then they also own the wires. So that red box is showing you that all of those unbundled services are completely together in the regulated structures of the state, which are referred to as non-opt-in entities. And so in those territories, customers do not have the ability to choose their provider. So that's high-level view of the stakeholders that are involved in the industry, electric industry, in ERCOT, and the debate. Similar to what Carrie went over with market design, the request here was to talk about what's kind of happened since Uri. And there have been a list of priorities. Obviously, the first and foremost is weatherization. All right, one of the first things you look at when we have a cold weather event or even a hot weather event is what were the weatherization issues that might have occurred, and could we improve upon that? Following Uri, definitely, the commission adopted probably one of the strictest weatherization standards that we see throughout the U.S. I just listed a few examples for cold weather weatherization that's included in the standard, which is windbreaks, insulation enclosures for critical weather components, inspection of existing thermal insulation. So ERCOT just completed their weatherization inspections for the ERCOT fleet. We certainly got our fair share of inspections, and we would have to walk the ERCOT inspectors around, show them where we have our windbreaks installed, all of our critical cold weather components are insulated and enclosed, and go through that checklist. Second on the list here is enhanced communication protocols. Pat mentioned that. There was a rule at the PUCT that implemented the power alert system. So it's one of the big things, big focus is to improve communication when ERCOT and the PUCT and stakeholders are working through and managing through a cold weather or hot weather emergency. Gas is another hot topic. Gas curtailment priority, critical load designation, and gas system weatherization. These were some of the issues that we saw during Uri that got some attention. There was an emergency order from the Road Commission to modify the priority. The Road Commission has recently adopted a rule for that. Critical loads as well. One of the issues that we saw impacts during Uri is natural gas delivery and processing facilities were actually curtailed, so that has been resolved through the critical load designation. And then weatherization. We still see a fairly healthy amount of production loss on the gas system. We did during Elliott last month, but we know that the gas folks are weatherizing, and the Road Commission does have inspection requirements as well. Carrie talked a little bit about the fuel resiliency, and that's the firm fuel product that was developed through Senate Bill 3 that was implemented for this winter. ERCOT actually deployed it last month during Winter Storm Elliott. And then the big topic that we're going to be walking into next is the financial incentives for dispatchable generation. So on the right-hand side, what those initiatives look like is enhancing the operating reserve demand curve. That's the chart that Carrie showed that increases your incentives to have generation respond in real time. The fuel reserves is the firm fuel product. Operational flexibility is one of the big topics in terms of increasing ancillary service procurement, buying more of the stuff that can come on soon and that can be there to resolve real-time issues with the grid versus the item in number 4, which is a resource adequacy solution, which is, do you have enough stuff in general? So that's one of the big debates that we've been having at the commission and we'll continue to have here in the legislature. Last topic for me is to touch on the importance of DERs, distributed energy resources, and emerging tech. And I think the theme here is the future is smaller. This chart that's on your left-hand side is a great chart from ERCOT that shows you, as we've progressed through time, the red line is the average size of generators in ERCOT, and the blue line is the count or the number of generators. And so what you're seeing is a move and a trend towards smaller distributed energy resources that are primarily located at customer sites. And the reason for that, it's less capital intensive, way more flexible, puts the customer in control of their energy future, which is one thing that's a big focus for my company. The but there would probably be ERCOT's perspective, less visible though. So you have to have faith that that's going to show up. It's not visible to the ISO, to the entity that actually manages the grid. DERs and distributed generation resources, they're just simply resources connected to the distribution system near at the customer sites, and benefits for the customer, energy and transmission cost reduction. And mainly what we're seeing more and more of is clean energy goals. A lot of residential demand for batteries, smart thermostat to use their usage profile. We think that's where a lot of the future is going to be, is unlocking that potential for the residential consumer, which is mainly untapped at this point. We have experimented, my company has experimented with a few different products where we roll out smart thermostat programs, and that's where I think a lot of the attention is going to be in the future, is making sure we can get more customer engagement, get folks involved. For the most part, Your average customer wants to hit the light switch and doesn't put a whole lot of thought into anything after that, and we want to try to change that. And then so teeing up the next discussion here, you're going to hear a lot about these terms, right? And this really hits to probably the biggest topic right now that's being discussed at the PUCT and will be discussed at the legislature, and that is the performance credit mechanism that was recently adopted by the PUCT. But it's really, the main topic is the difference between resource adequacy and operational flexibility. And this really boils down to, what is the problem that we are trying to solve? What is the problem that policymakers are trying to solve? Operational flexibility is really the solution to making sure that you have enough stuff available right now to solve issues on the grid when there are fluctuations in renewable output, fluctuations in load, power plants trip offline, things like that. It's a very short-term focus. And those solutions, which we have enhanced recently, as Carrie's mentioned, with ERCOT, is ancillary services. ERCOT has procured more of a product called non-spin, significantly more, to enhance their operating flexibility capabilities. A new ERCOT ancillary service is being implemented in May called Contingency Reserve Service, which is a 10-minute ramp product. ERCOT uses Reliability Unit Commitment, or RUC, to out-of-market start generators so that they're there as well to provide reserves in real time. Carrie has supported a 2 to 4 hour ahead uncertainty product, which would achieve a similar objective, having enough stuff online and running, have enough generators online and running. ERCOT has also implemented planned outage restrictions, and I have the question mark behind the BRS, backstop reliability services, whether that's a resource adequacy solution or operating flexibility. Resource adequacy is a completely different goal and objective, and that goal is to ensure that there's enough stuff, period. So, and you need one to have the other, right? If you don't have resource adequacy, you're not going to have enough resources for operating flexibility. But it really comes down to the risk appetite of our customers, of our regulators. How much risk are we willing to bear in terms of how the market functions? Resource adequacy provides you another layer, another buffer of resources to be there. So good resource adequacy solutions that we've seen implemented, this is consistent with what the direction that the PUCT is headed, is you define a reliability standard. So you have to set a goal first as to what you want the market to accomplish, and then you have a technology neutral mechanism to achieve it that puts both generation and demand response resources on a level playing field. Bad resource adequacy solutions that we see, scarcity pricing is one. Why is that a bad resource adequacy solution? Because it's not trying to achieve resource adequacy. It's trying to achieve operating flexibility and have enough stuff on right now. And it requires the thing that we don't want, scarcity, right? Our customers have made it very clear there's almost zero tolerance for grid outages. So any mechanism that relies on scarcity is probably going to miss the mark in terms of what our customers expect. Increasing ancillary services, backstop reliability, and then reliability must run, which is an out-of-market procurement of capacity. And that speaks to probably the ultimate bad solution, which is a partial re-regulation of our wholesale market or a state-mandated procurement of generation. That, like Carrie had mentioned, is basically the end of the market. And so as we debate these potential outcomes, that's what we're comparing them to, is because those are the alternatives that we've heard proposed before in the last session, which is really a partial re-regulation of our competitive market. And that is my company's biggest concern and what we're trying to fend off. Last slide before we get to our panel is, why is resource adequacy needed? This chart shows you the amount of offline reserves in the ERCOT market. These are 30-minute or less generation resources. This is from July 11th in blue, July 13th in orange. Yep, orange. This shows you that for a span of 3 to 4 hours in the summer, we had 0 left. That means there's nothing else to start up. That is not a great place to be in if you're worried about resource adequacy, because the whole point of a resource adequacy solution is to ensure that you can operate through contingencies. A planning reserve margin means that you have to have a grid that can work through and plan through forced outages of thermal plants, changes in renewable output. And so this is, when we talk about what the policy goal is, what are customers comfortable with, what are our regulators comfortable with, if we're okay with periods of grid tightness and higher risk, then I agree with Carrie. We don't need to do anything. But what we've heard is that's not the case. Our customers, residential customers in particular, get pretty upset when we have grid or emergencies and grid outages. So if that's the customer that we're really thinking about when we're developing policy, then we probably need to have something a little bit more than what we have right now. So I'll stop there.
Next, I want to introduce Phil Jankowski, who is with the Austin Bureau of the Dallas Morning News, to moderate a panel with our guests so far. Thanks, Phil.
Thank you. We're running a little late. We'll try not to run in a happy hour too much, but we might get out of here a little bit after 5. So last Thursday afternoon, as most of you all know, the Public Utility Commission approved the performance credit mechanism. Maybe that would have been the end of the story, but less than 90 minutes later, Senator Charles Schwertner tweeted the following: "It's unacceptable," he said, and this is the man who authored Senate Bill 3, the bill that got this whole process started. So I'm curious, from y'all's perspective, and hopefully to the benefit of our audience, they're going to be seeing a lot of legislation, most likely, about the performance credit mechanism, the ERCOT power grid. And so I'm just curious what you think they should all be on the lookout for, whether you think the performance credit mechanism is enough, and what you hope to achieve this session. I know that's really 3 questions in one, but I'll start with you.
You can start with me.
I'll
Okay.
start with you. I know, just for a little context, I know NRG is a member of the Texas Competitive Power Advocates, which is in favor of the PCM. You, a couple of weeks ago, in front of the Public Utility Commission, said that having the PCM would encourage you guys to build roughly 1.6 or 1,600 megawatts of power generation. So it's my impression that you are in favor of what was done. Is that correct?
So, yes, but there's obviously some explanation as to why that is I think we are in favor of a resource adequacy solution in ERCOT, mainly because that's what we're hearing from our customers. After Uri, in July, even when there were conservation alerts, we get a lot of feedback from our customers in terms of their appetite for grid issues, grid emergencies. And we have searched through this last couple of years. Obviously, we've been talking about resource adequacy and market design for decades, probably, since Pat was around. And market design, it always comes down to, it's really risk management and risk tolerance. What are you trying to manage in terms of the levers that you can pull? Pat's slide that had that triangle that went from 100% down to 0, I think, is a good one. And I think that's what we're trying to find here, is really how you manage risk and manage reliability in power market design. Is you have 2 main levers. You have energy and capacity. And in ERCOT, we've always had the energy lever at 9, assuming 9 out of 10 scale, and we had capacity set at 1. And I think the worry is people think that we're going to end up like PJM, where we have energy at 1 and capacity at 9. And that has a big impact on the competitive retail market, has a big impact on the ability for DERs and others to participate. And that has never been the goal for my company anyway. To me, we have been trying to search for something somewhere in the middle, which is similar to what Pat was saying. Somewhere where maybe we take the energy lever down to maybe 7 and we move the capacity lever up to 3. And that has the benefit of stabilizing the market to some extent, so it makes it more investable. One of the challenges with a scarcity pricing based regime is it relies on volatility, and it relies on scarcity prices that can be unpredictable. One, it requires scarcity, which is obviously a problem, but also it's very, very difficult to predict out into the future. which is typically when we see the biggest scarcity pricing events, it's because no one saw it coming. So it's hard to make long-term investment decisions on short-term prices. The PCM takes a few steps in that direction, and there's a lot of tuning and design that can go into the PCM so that it emphasizes the energy market, which is one thing that we've looked at that we liked about it. Is I think the E3 study showed that only 25% of the revenues would come from the PC itself versus 75% of the revenues still come from the energy market, which is what we would want to see, is emphasize the current market structure there. But our concern is reliability, and that is the risk that we think we're trying to manage when we're tuning and pulling these levers on the market structure, is to bump up the amount of reliability that we get out of the market design so that we lower the risk for our consumers.
Yeah, if I could move on down to you, Carrie. You, as you mentioned, you specifically put down comments that said that you don't want this. You'd rather to have something that keeping really the energy only market with some changes to it. So yeah, I'm curious what you think about it. Then we'll move on to you, Pat.
Yeah, that's true. We don't support this. It's a novel mechanism to. It's just a different take at an existing idea of paying generators for capacity for being available. It's just a novel way to do that. And the way that it's defined is going to be very important. So there's going to be, it's a very loose framework at this point. And we're going to be spending our time in the next 6 months over trying to, we want to protect the ERCOT market, and we want to make sure that all these bullet point decisions that get decided are going to be the ones that, don't harm the market and are the most efficient for the market. There's a lot of issues with the incentives that the performance credit mechanism creates, and creates a lot of inefficiencies. Depending on how it's designed, people are going to stop making widgets when they don't need to stop making widgets. Like, that affects the economic output of Texas, or generators are going to be online when they don't need to be online, and that has a cost to everybody. So my concern is that the way that this is going to be designed is just going to create a lot of inefficiencies and it's just not needed. I think there are other ways to tackle the operational flexibility issues that we have, and this wholly new approach is too novel for Texas to undertake at this point.
Yeah, Pat, you were here, helming the creation of the energy only market. I'm curious what you think about when you see a proposal that really says that we're going to bifurcate this market and do, roughly 30% of it, $5.7 billion, will be, dedicated to these performance credits. I'm curious what you think about the proposal there.
I did tell the current chairman, I said it's been a generation since we did this market. In light of what happened in Uri, from the old guard, we'll support wherever you want to go on rethinking the market. So at the time, we honestly didn't look at capacity markets. They were just barely formed in PJM. And the PJM is probably the most sophisticated of all the markets I regulated at FERC. While I was at FERC, I got very exposed to capacity markets in New England, New York, PJM, which is the Mid-Atlantic region. So that's the largest. That's about double the size of ERCOT. And then California part of their problem was they didn't have any sort of forward signal to build. And so their market crashed in '99, which is another story I can tell you over many beers. But, I would say, Phil, the capacity construct, I'm not allergic to it, but the problem that needs to be solved, and this is what we mentioned in our comments to the commission, that we're generally supportive of the goals of the PCM, is that you've got to solve that long, cold winter night problem, which we had in Uri, which is everybody has great dinner with their Valentine, we go to bed, and then the state falls apart at 1:30 a.m. ERCOT heroic staff saves the state from going into the Stone Ages at 1:37 a.m. All this drama going on at night, you wake up and the state is short power. that's a long period of time for a battery. Not enough time to unthaw or to fix a plant that was not winterized. So, I mean, a lot of those things probably happened and got fixed. But ERCOT still does a study twice a year that looks at the extreme scenarios, which aren't so extreme anymore now that the world's becoming a bit more volatile on the climate front, for whatever reason. It says we're about 7,000, maybe 9,000, X thousand megawatts short on an extreme cold with high forced outages and low renewable output, which is exactly what we had on February 15th, 2021. And so that's the problem I'd solve for. If you solve for, and I think this might have been where you're going backwards, Bill, but the backwards side of what you were saying forwards, is if you solve that resource adequacy problem, you've, of definition, solved the shorter-term operational issues, which batteries are beautifully fit to do, but batteries can't solve that long problem. So I'm kind of admitting this against interest that I'd love to think I could save the world with my batteries, but let's be honest, we need something other than that. And so if Carrie's in fact right, that we are sending enough money to that system to incentivize those solutions to come and to come quickly, good. But that ought to be what we're solving for, is that cold, dark winter night. And I think the commissioners know this. The PCM program is pretty loosely defined, I think was the words Carrie just used, and I would agree with that they left a lot of flex in the system that's going to be worked out in the stakeholder process led by ERCOT over the coming years. But at its core, I think it's just got to, we talk about is it 1 year in 10 and all these reliability numbers. I'm just like, close that URI gap. That's 7,000. I mean, again, I should have come in here with that number exactly to the decimal. Close that gap. It's going to take a few years to close that gap. I don't think we're out of the vulnerability stage yet, Phil. I mean, I know y'all have written about this beautifully in your paper, better than all the other papers. Thank you for that. But I think we're moving in the right direction, but we do still have some years of vulnerability that regardless of the program we pick, the commission picks and the legislature advises them on, I think we've got a period here where we've just got to be all hands on deck. These forced outages of the existing plants cannot happen. Christmas was a great running test. I don't think we had the severe weather we were expecting, but it was pretty damn severe. And then last year we had another one in February of 22. So 22 we had two good tests during that year of the new system. It did okay. But I'm not going to sit back and be comfortable until I see that ERCOT study for winter of 24 say in the extreme case we're going to maybe have to ask some industrials to turn down. That's the win. But until then, I'm not really, really, really happy.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So a lot of the, talk leading up to the beginning of the session has really been focused on the whole market design really feels like it's been highly focused on incentivizing the construction, new steel in the ground for dispatchable energy, which is just code word for natural gas power plants here in Texas, more or less. I mean, like Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, for instance, I mean, he didn't even say, he said we're going to have special sessions if we don't get something approved here at the Capitol that is going to ensure that new natural gas plants are built. But I wanted to talk about something that is not really being talked about, and that is about, on the customer side, how we reduce demand, because that really, I feel like, hasn't been part of the discussion. I know that you guys recently have made some sort of investment into that, and so I wanted to talk about how practical it is and how possible it is that we can actually try to tackle this possibly from the other end of the of y'all's very nice infographics.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take a swing at that first, and that was probably the first point I wanted to try to make at the PUCT a few weeks ago, is because when we hear the term new build, it's almost exclusively referring to new thermal generation, which is, sure, we need some of that too, but a much bigger piece of the solution for our system is battery storage and then the customer side, which is, again, I think increasingly a focus from our company, is demand response. And this is also part of, I think, why Carrie doesn't like it, because of how the cost allocation mechanism, the PCM, is currently structured. It would be a gigantic incentive for demand response because you are measuring how the costs are allocated to load-serving entities or retail electric providers is based on those low reserve periods or peak net load, however you want to say it. It's basically when the grid needs you to respond the most is where you're going to get measured as an LSE based on your cost. And so if we can reduce our consumption during those times when the reserves are low, you want to respond when the grid needs you, right? Then we will reduce our cost. And we have done some back of the envelope math on the value that creates for demand response, and it's significant. It is probably on par, if not more, than the value of 4CP. So that is one of the things we're most interested in and excited about in terms of any resource adequacy construct is unlocking more demand response, which is really the low-hanging fruit in our market, and that has been a struggle under a scarcity pricing regime because there's not enough value there. So for sure, that aspect is one, and we are looking at smart thermostat programs to get that done. We have made a big acquisition in a smart home platform called Bivens, and we're looking to really leverage the smart thermostat capability there so that you all can help play a part in our resource adequacy solution.
Bill, can I ask a question?
I want to respond too, but you go ahead.
Well, I'm going to pick up on your thing because it was one.
Oh, and this is probably our last question.
This is sticking.
We've got to get to the bar.
So this is sticking, and we'll be really good after a couple of drinks. At the $5,000, your points resonate with me. Is the $5,000 price cap? Now, I know we've taken Gritty and the price signal away to my deep lament, but I know that the legislature will reverse that error and fix it. But in the meantime, people, if they got price signals each minute of the day, because that's the only way you're going to be able to save money from avoiding. If you want to get good behavior, put a charge out there that people can evade. So what we've done is transmission charges. The big industrials have the ability to turn off for the peak 4 days of the year so they won't get a big transmission bill next year. It's dumb luck that we figured that out, how to do that. But that kind of thing, it seems like, isn't that sending enough of a signal to people to not drive us over the edge? But the problem.
Well, I agree with that.
Except for in the middle of the night of President's Day when nobody looked at their thermostat.
Yeah, the problem with 4CP and the transmission cost allocation mechanism is, one, it doesn't apply to the winter, and two, it's based on gross peak load, which is increasingly the needs of our grid are not peak load, they are net peak load.
I agree. So forget that analogy, but I'm just saying that the point is, what would the price signal of $5,000 of it going up to $5,000 generally be something we can use to really discipline the system? And I'm just sitting there going, does the PCM after the fact really add much that the $5,000 price in the future wouldn't scare?
If you're not talking, so if
on
you're not
demand response,
4CP or scarcity pricing in general, $5,000 prices are a great operational flexibility tool. You're going to get folks to respond right now. Startup, quick starts. You're going to get your batteries responding. You're going to get response by consumers. But again, if you're looking at long-term investment signals, there's a challenge there. It's been a challenge in this market for 20 years. Now, we're getting stuff built. We've gotten stuff built, but is it enough? Is it enough to meet that buffer that gives us that extra cushion? And that's the question that we have not seen answered in this market.
Well, I just want to say that I absolutely support demand response. I just don't support uneconomic demand response. If it's $20, if energy prices is $20, we have this artificial performance credit mechanism that's measuring something when prices are $20. It would be very terrible for all sorts of industries to shut down when the energy prices just do not support it. And that's my concern.
Well, that's really all we have time for, unfortunately. But I mean, let's give these folks a round of applause. Thank you so much.